prayer requests, but we'll do that in the future. How about that? So remind me to do that. All right, so we do have a recording in progress, right? Good. All right, so we're good there. Let me see. I need 2 readers for today to help me out, just to read a couple of slides. Anybody willing to do that? Julia is willing. Thank you, Julia. And do I have one more? Anyone? Anyone? Thanks, Logan. I know you didn't want to keep hearing me say that like over and over again. All right. There was a famous movie where a teacher said that, but never mind about that. All right. So I assume everybody can hear there you go, Bueller. Yeah. How do you know that? That was like an 80s movie. Anyway, I assume you guys can hear me since you're answering my questions, and I think you all said you can see the presentation, so that's good. So let me know if you're before and ahead of your time. If my voice drops or gets choppy and you need something repeated, also let me know. By the way, how would you rate my voice, 1 to 10, the voice quality? I mean, like if I get really loud, does it start getting scratchy? 9.99. Okay, I guess that's good. So if I get really loud, it does get scratchy. I guess I'll even take a 7.7. No scratchiness yet. Okay, good. 'Cause I think I have it set so it won't do that. So that's good. Let me know too if I'm ever advancing through slides and it doesn't seem to be advancing for you. That could be a problem on my end. It could be a problem on your end. If you do have technical problems, I put a link in the email that I sent you, potterschool.org, which is, basic, right? potterschool.org, but /live-support. They are your lifeline if you're having problems, because usually teachers like me are clueless how to fix your tech problems. So you want to go to them, okay? Oh, did everybody print out the notes in the study place? That is going to be really, really helpful for you. Great, you guys did. If you didn't, go ahead and grab it now. Print them out. It's a PDF that gives you basically many, if not most, of the slides I'll be using. It wasn't necessary for me to put all the slides that I'm using, but anyway, it also gives you area for note taking, so that'll be very helpful. Let me answer questions that I'm sure you have, because probably teachers are different on this. I don't mind chatting in class as long as you're staying on topic. I certainly don't mind questions. Give me questions, but chatting, and sometimes I'll go off-road a little bit, and we do that for fun. We do that to keep the class interesting, but usually there's a method to my madness. And so anyway, as long as the chatting is on topic wherever I'm taking it, we're good. So chatting is encouraged. As far as questions, ask questions. Sometimes I don't see a question, so if I don't address it, if you will private chat it to me, that makes it come up in red for me, which is like flashing red to a bull, and it's like, oh, I must have missed the question. Now, if that's the case, I'll either address it then, or I'll say, oh, good question. Hey, let's take it up at the end of class. Sometimes because of time, I can't take it up. But if I completely ignore it, assume that I didn't see it. I mean, that should be your basic assumption, because otherwise I'll at least address it to answer it right away or put it off to the end of the class. And if we don't have time at the end of class, then I'll deal with it in either in an email or we pick it up the next week. But I do like answering your questions, and so and I know there'll be questions. So if I'm not addressing it, it's because either I'm looking at my notes for something and I miss it. Sometimes it's because the chat box is moving too fast, and so I miss things. So please don't assume that I'm ignoring you. I'm not. Homework. Homework is due right before the next class, and that should be obvious from what it says in your assignments. I follow the Potter School policy, which is 10% late fee per day. So don't get behind on things. If for some reason you know your homework is going to be late because you're traveling, or somehow you know you're going to get appendicitis, let me know in advance. Just kidding on that last one there. uh, but yeah, do let me know in advance if you've got a trip plan, because email me at mrpratt12@gmail.com. Telling me in class is probably not the best idea because I won't have a record of it and I'll forget. So email me, tell me what section you're in. You guys are in section 1. Yeah, if it's and if you don't tell me in advance, then then it's late afterwards. And even though there might be some mercy, there's still going to be lateness. There's a penalty. So let me, this is good practice to be diligent with these things. Take responsibility. Let me know about your upcoming events. Hey, this is why you homeschool, right? So that you have that flexibility, and I will be flexible with you. Just now, I recognize there are drastic emergencies, like people die and things like that, and I get that. But for the most part, when you just don't all of a sudden take a trip, usually. So let me know ahead of time. I think I've said that enough times. Hopefully that's sunk in, right? Fluidity without framework is just mush. Oh, nice use of the English language. I think I said this, I know I said this, but when you email me, please include your section number. That really helps. Again, in your section 1. Section 1. Speaking of email, I do use it in emergencies, but for most of the class recaps, you're going to hopefully get used to looking at them in the Messages tab. And here's an example of what you would see in your Message tab. Hopefully you already saw this. Did you guys already see this message there, by the way, before class? Yes, you are number 1. Good. So some of you know the drill already, and as you can see, I've already got many of the messages class recaps. So I know my students find that these recaps helpful. Some of them give you little tidbits for help on homework. Some of them give you great suggestions for discussions with your parents, which parents I think really appreciate. So parents, if you're listening, kids, don't turn the volume down. If you're listening, look at the message recaps, because that'll let you know what's going on in class and questions that you guys can discuss. All right, hopefully parents heard that in the background there. I'll get to what I do for a regular job in just a second, but let me just say for starters that sometimes my work provides for interruptions. Sometimes I know in advance that I've got to cancel class, and so I'll email you if that's the case. I won't put it in the message tab. I will email you. So sometimes there's work interruptions that I've just, I've got to travel or something like that, or I'll have some major interview that I can't get out of, and I'll get to that, speaking of interviews. Sometimes the work interruptions come during class, although when that happens, typically speaking, they're very brief, like 5-10 minutes tops. So, then it's a great time for you guys to just see what's going on with each other. But otherwise, the interruptions during class are usually very infrequent and very short. All right. So with all that said, again, my name is, I shouldn't say again because I don't think I've told you who I am. But you probably already know, all right? You've got class with Mr. Pratt. My name is Eric Pratt, and this is the high school French class that we'll be dealing with this semester, okay? Oui. Guys are like, what? I'm in the wrong class. Bonjour. I don't know a lick of French, so. Pero yo sí hablo español. Así es que podemos hacer la clase en español si quieres. Just had a French class this morning. Yeah, that would be torture, wouldn't it, Hannah? Twice in one day. Now, this is your high school civil government class. It goes one semester. Well, this class goes one semester, although there is a part 2. So, and I'll talk to you about that from time to time because statistically speaking, several of you will end up taking part 2, and that class is a lot of fun as well, probably even more fun than the Section 1 class, but don't tell the Section 1 kids that. Oh wait, I already did. Or I should have said semester 1 kids. Anyway, this semester we're going to be looking at the biblical foundations of civil government. We're also going to be looking at the U.S. Constitution a lot. Hopefully everybody's got the book. I know some of you, the book is in transit because you've just ordered it last week or this week. Everybody who's ordered it, it's at least in the mail. Hopefully, and if you have the DVD, hopefully you already saw the first session, which I encourage you to watch just because we'll be talking about some of that today. Did anybody get a chance to watch that first session in the DVD? Okay, good. At least a smattering of you did. Good. How did you like it? Hopefully it made sense, even made you chuckle a little. It was funny when I was doing it, there were some kind of like people in the audience and they were busting a gut, especially when I got to the wrestler part. Now, those of you who didn't watch it, like the wrestler part with government? What? Oh, we'll get there. Anyway, so we're going to be spending the next several weeks together. So we're either going to get sick of each other or we'll have a great time together. Hopefully the latter. But anyway, my hope is that at the end of the semester, you guys know the U.S. Constitution, in other words, our American system of government, and the biblical principles of government better than even your counterparts in the public schools. And, that's not a gratuitous slam on public school kids. It just recognizes that when the average American kid is surveyed about civics, well, the results are incredibly embarrassing. For example, look at these survey results of American teenagers, and I'm going to ask you the questions that they were asked. And I know you haven't taken government yet, so if you don't know the answers to these, don't feel bad, okay? But I would bet that even before taking government, you will do better than a lot of these students did. So let me ask you this. Just type in your chat box if you know the answer. What are the first 10 amendments called? What are the first 10 amendments called? First 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Very good. Okay, several of you already knew this. I'll ask you this question. Who is the comedian talk show host who until recently, he just retired, until recently had a top 10 list every night? In fact, he's there pictured on the right. So that might jog your memory if you've ever seen him, although that's a younger picture of him. Okay, so we're getting some blank stares. He does look familiar-ish. Yeah, well, the fact that he's retired, maybe that's why. Because I've always had at least one student be able to answer this question. It's not Donald Trump. No, but that was good. That trumps everybody else's answer, which was no answer. No, it was, is David Letterman. And he just retired, so not surprising that he had a very funny top 10 list every night. But anyway, here's the deal. When interviewed or surveyed, more teenagers could identify David Letterman as the comedian talk show host who had a top 10 list every night than knew that the Bill of Rights refers to the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Isn't it interesting that you guys were completely reversed? More of you knew about the Bill of Rights. Yeah, maybe that's why, you didn't say you didn't recognize him. I probably should have used an older, a more recent picture of him. Anyway, in answer to this question, though, some of the students interviewed, what are the first 10 amendments called? Some of them answered the Pledge of Allegiance. It is not. That is not the first 10. Question. Here we go. Where was written? Go ahead, type it in if you know. Where was the Constitution written? Looks like things got choppy for everybody. Where was the Constitution written? Like physically written. Who knows? Philly. Yes, sir. Philadelphia. Well, here's the deal. Because of a popular TV show, 3 times as many students could name the city, which has a zip code of 90210. That's Beverly Hills, California, if you were wondering. But three times as many students knew that as could identify where the U.S. Constitution was written, which was Philadelphia. In fact, many of them thought our Constitution was written in France. Hence the reason I gave you the Eiffel Tower. It was not written in France. Oh my. Next, what are the 3 branches of government? Judicial, legislative, executive. Now, we'll be talking a lot about this during the year. Good. Some of you knew that. What are the names of the 3 stooges? I don't know. These guys are so old. Maybe, unless you watch TV Land, you probably never even heard of them, right? No idea. Larry, Curly, and Moe. Good. Some of you guys know this. Well, here again. See, you guys are trumping already the average student out there. More students could name one of the 3 stooges as could identify what the 3 branches of the federal government were. All right. One more question, just so you get the point, although this one's going to be a little bit harder. I'll tell you up front. Very few students are able to get this one. Who is known as the father of the Constitution? Who is known as the father of the Constitution? We have votes for Madison, Samuel Adams, Madison or Jefferson. Well, we do have a correct answer. The answer is Madison, and he's pictured there on the left in the middle. That's Madison. Let me ask you this. Who's the father of the computer company Microsoft? Probably most of you are going to know this. Bill Gates. That's right. Not Steve Jobs. That was the other company, right? Macintosh. Yeah, Bill Gates. Well, here we go with the survey results. Less than 2% of teenagers knew that James Madison was the father of the U.S. Constitution, but more than half could identify Bill Gates as the father of the computer company Microsoft. In fact, when being asked about the Constitution, many of the students thought that it was written in 1892. Yeah, 1892. If you haven't already pieced that together, that would mean the Constitution was written after the Civil War. So in other words, we fought a civil war even before we became a country and had a constitution. I mean, that just makes no sense. Look, if any of you ever answers a question like that to somebody who's doing a survey, I will disavow any knowledge of you or having taught you, okay? You know, kind of like Mission Impossible. I will disavow any knowledge of ever having known you. All right, that's pretty harsh, but you get the picture. American kids who have studied government don't know some of the most basic things about government. Well, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I told you I was going to introduce myself, so let me do that. I work as a communications director for an organization that is dedicated to preserving the Second Amendment in the Constitution. Now, I know we haven't studied it yet, but does anybody know what the Second Amendment is? Guns, yep, gun owners of America. That is who I work for, but right to keep and bear arms. That's right. So what I do is I write newsletters, I speak on the radio, sometimes get on TV too. There's a picture of me on TV. You know, in one sense, it's strange that I'm in this job because I grew up not wanting anything to do with politics. I hated politics. My dad had worked in politics all his life, and even though I loved my dad, I just thought what he did was boring, and I wanted nothing to do with what he did for a living. But a funny thing happened on the way to my career. The Lord grabbed a hold of me in college and pulled me out of my rebellious ways, and so when I recommitted, yeah, the irony of life, right? That's funny, Julia. You've always loved politics. See, that was not me growing up. I was sports first and foremost, In fact, and you see that as you read my book. There's a lot of sports analogies. I still love sports, although hopefully put it in its proper place. I'm not one of those like sports crazy husbands that has to, watch sports 24 hours a day. That's not me. Although that would have been me at one time. But see, that was before God got a hold of me. And so when I recommitted my life to Christ, this was right at the end of college, at the end of my senior year, or like halfway through my senior year. I really wanted to start looking at life the way my Savior and Lord looked at life. And so I actually came to see that the Bible really does have a lot to say about government and politics. And um, believe it or not, I started getting excited about political and government type issues for the first time in my life. In fact, it was actually kind of scary. I was like, what is happening to me? I mean, imagine becoming interested in something you've hated all your life. It was really a weird experience for me. But just to give you an example of, some of the things that started occurring to me, and to give you a flavor for this, what are some of the titles or names for God? Just random, throw them out in your chat box. Yeah, amen, Julia. That's exactly right. And we're going to be talking about that a lot, the proper lenses that we should be looking at things through. So Yahweh, Creator, El Shaddai, Prince of Peace, Jehovah Jireh. Okay, you guys have hit the tip of the iceberg. What are some other names for God? Maybe you took a Sunday school class that studied different names for God. Okay, King of Kings. King of Kings and Lord of Lords, glory. Right? Remember that song? Now, speaking of names like King of Kings and Lord of Lords or Judge, I mean, all these are terms that or names that are given to God. Think about that. Aren't those governmentish sounding titles, right? Ish. Yeah. Well, I actually came to see that God has a lot to say about government. So as I started studying the Bible more, my worldview started becoming less and less secular. By secular, I mean, without taking God into account. So my worldview started becoming more and more biblical. Worldviews are really important. Julia mentioned it's the lens that we look at things through. You know, um, I think it's important as we begin this class and begin this semester to talk about what a worldview is and then apply it to the subject of civil government. So let's talk about that. And I want to read from 2 Corinthians 10, verses 4 and 5, which is a good passage in this regard. Believe me, there are a zillion passages that I could have picked to make this point or to use this as a jumping off pad, launching point. But this is as good enough a passage as any. So we'll start here. But here's what Paul says: the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Now let me pause here. Hopefully you see what he's saying, because Paul is talking about the battle over the mind. He's talking about opposing worldly wisdom, which, believe me, is a battle that we should be engaged in every day, just fighting it in ourselves. And so what a Christian worldview wants to do is take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. Think of it this way. What is the greatest commandment? The greatest commandment as identified by Jesus. And yes, we have a role in the fight. And I don't think you would deny that, Julia, but obviously it's with God's power that we fight the fight. And as far as the number one command, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Yes. Now, let me just emphasize one of those words: all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. You see, part of loving God is loving him with all our mind. And one of the ways we do that, Paul is showing us here, is that we take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. Now, I assume I'm talking to Christians, and I think most, if not all of you are. And I say assume because, look, I recognize you can grow up in a church, hear the word, even believe the word, and not quite yet become a Christian. I mean, I didn't become a Christian until I was about y'all's age. I was 16 years old. I'd grown up in the church all my life. Most of that time, I actually thought I was a Christian because I understood the gospel. I understood I'm a sinner. I need a Savior. The part that I was struggling with was the lordship part. And it was actually a friend that helped me realize that I can't just claim Jesus as Savior if I'm not going to recognize him as Lord. Not that we do that perfectly, but if we're not even willing to say, yeah, you're in charge, then it's almost like, oh yeah, thanks for the lifesaver. Now let me just go do what I want. And yeah, I got to realize that's not quite the message of the gospel. So, I accepted Christ as the Lord of my life. And I hope the same is true for you. I mean, and let's face it, that's a daily battle because we're full of all kinds of temptations. So, to say Jesus is Lord, the only way you really, really want to do that is if He's worked in your heart, if He's changed your desires. Because otherwise, it's like, yeah, I'm not sure I do want to do that. And I get that. I lived that way for a long time. But here's the deal. If He is your Lord, you're going to want to make sure that every action, every thought is taken captive to Jesus Christ. You want to make sure that it pleases God. Not that our salvation is based on doing everything perfectly. Obviously, it's not. It can't be. None of us would make it. But because He has saved us, because He has died for us, we should want to do the things that please Him. We know that with relationships on this earth, it's all the more true with God. We don't earn His love. He loves us because His Son died for us. But then, right, as Julia points out, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. So if He's worked in us and we love Him, well, one of the ways we show that love is by obeying Him. And part of that obedience is taking every thought captive. And so, where do we do that? Well, it's all of life. It's not just government class. It's all of life. It's when you're watching TV. It's when you're listening to the radio. You're taking every thought captive. It's when you're planning your day. You could just waste the time away, and it could just be 24/7 entertainment. That might not be the best way to recognize Jesus as Lord. I mean, I'm not preaching against, having some fun and stuff like that. But, I mean, if we're just living for pleasure, then we're probably not living for God. As James says, if you're a friend of the world, you're an enemy of God. So every thought should conform to God's will or understanding. Well, when we look at political or government issues, a biblical worldview is going to ask, well, what is God's point of view? See, a worldview is, quite simply, how you view the world. Julia earlier mentioned it's the lens that we use to view the world. Some people see the world as God sees it. Okay, that's using a biblical lens. That's a biblical worldview. Others see the world through the limits of their own human understanding. That's what we might call the man-centered view. Okay? And so we're going to be looking at both views and comparing them and applying this whole concept of worldview to civil government throughout the whole semester. But realize, while we're applying it to civil government, it applies to everything. I mean, take your parents. You can view your parents through God's eyes, or you can view your parents through sinful, selfish eyes. The world says disobey, argue, complain until you get what you want. I mean, I'm sure none of you have ever done that. Right? Never. And your teacher never did that growing up. Right? Yeah, right. Your nose is growing, Julia. But God said, what does God say? What does a biblical worldview says? A biblical worldview says, honor your parents. That word honor means to give great weight to. In other words, you consider what they say as even more important than what you want to do. Well, that's hard, Mr. Yeah, that's hard. That's why God made it one of the 10 commandments. It's hard. But see, that's what having a biblical worldview does. It says, okay, here's a situation. What's God's view on it? Everybody runs their life according to a certain set of principles, and those principles are either going to be God's standards or they're going to be man's limited reason. You might also think of a worldview as the story that you use to explain what you see or what you believe. Let me give you an example that shows how a worldview determines how you understand things in the world. And I think this helps just demonstrate that facts don't speak for themselves. Whether you're looking at creation, whether you're looking at political issues like abortion, or whether you're watching the news or the people reporting the news, we always need a worldview or a story to help us interpret what we see. Okay, let me give you an example. Who knows what this is? I mean, on the left you have a coin. Who knows what that is on the right? What does that look like? Looks like a tooth, doesn't it? Yeah, probably a molar. Looks like a tooth that's in badly need of a dentist, doesn't it? But it's a tooth. Now, there's an interesting, looks like a fossil tooth, right? Well, there's an interesting story about a fossil tooth. Years ago, archaeologists did find a fossil tooth, and they were really excited. Do you know why they were excited about this particular fossil tooth? Well, it's because they were sure that this tooth belonged to a missing link. And so they called him Nebraska Man. And they drew all these pictures about what Nebraska Man looked like and stuff like that. However, there was just one problem. Years later, they found another tooth just like it, and this is what that tooth was attached to. Can you tell me what you think that looks like? That is exactly right. It is a pig skull. So Nebraska Man was really a pig. Of course, don't all women think that us men are pigs? So maybe they were right. But anyway, you know what's interesting about this? Not always. Thanks, Julia. Here's what's interesting about this. For 40 years, just meant from Nebraska, there you go. Public school textbooks for 40 years still kept teaching that Nebraska Man was an evolutionary ancestor, even though the scientific community knew that it wasn't true. Now, modern day public school textbooks no longer teach it, but for 40 years they did. Aren't you glad your parents are homeschooling you? But here's the thing. You can understand the evolutionist frustration. I mean, they go digging for fossils, but they find these big gaps between the kinds in the fossil record. For example, they find fish, they find reptiles in the fossil record, but they don't find in-between forms linking them. They don't find fish tiles, right? I mean, in the evolutionist worldview, they go searching for these transitional in-between forms. They don't find the in-between links. So what do they call them when they can't find them? What do they call these transitional forms that they can't find? Yes, missing links. There's a famous missing link. Did you ever see that Geico commercial with the hairy missing link? Those series are always kind of funny. But here's the question. Are the missing links really missing? Let's take a quick quiz here. Usually every class I'll ask you a quiz, and these quizzes are just for fun. So here's the first just for fun quiz. Why do missing links are missing? Is it because A, they think there's a grand creationist conspiracy to dig up these in-between forms and hide them? Is it because B, they're too lazy to look for these forms, so they just say they're missing? Or is it C, because their theory says the links should be there and they're not? A, B, or C? Why does the evolutionist say there is? Yes. See, their theory says, in other words, their worldview says the links should be there, but they're not. So when they're not, they say they're missing. See, Their theory says that things evolved upward from mice to men, you might say from rat to prat, right? From goo to zoo. That's what their story says. But how about this story? How about this lens? As a creationist, which I am, I don't believe there's missing links. My story is taken from Genesis 1 and 2, and it says, and other places in the Bible, and it says that God created things as they are. Fish were fish, reptiles were reptiles. There were no fish tiles. There was no macroevolution, no amoeba to man, no rat to prat. So here's the question. How can these links be missing when they were never there to begin with? You see, that's the importance of a worldview. Your starting assumptions are going to determine how you view the facts. Exactly, Julia. They change the evidence, and that's because I mean, to be honest, every now and then they do come up with something that they say, "Oh, this is a missing link," and people will believe it for 5, 10 years or whatever, like Nebraska Man. And then when they realize, oh, it's not the missing link, then they quietly just delete it from the textbooks and they look for something else. So yeah, they're constantly trying to change the evidence instead of. Now, there are some that have rejected evolution as a result, and you might call them honest evolutionists, but very few of them do, because usually it's a moral thing that's going on. Like some of the famous evolutionists have said, the reason we jumped at Darwin's theory was because it justified doing what we wanted to do, and some put it really crassly, like, you know, it justified our sexual morals. So, you know, basically they wanted to live loose, and evolution justified it. But if there's a God that you have to be accountable to, well, you know, there's a lot of things he says don't do. or you know, there's some things that are not the right time to do. So anyway, but you know, here's the point. In looking at a worldview, your starting assumption determines how you view the facts. I started this off by saying facts don't speak for themselves. It's true that facts are facts, but how we interpret those facts depends upon our story. It depends upon our worldview. You know, take a look at the news today. If you look at the news, it doesn't matter when you look at the news or who's president, you always read or hear a lot about unemployment. It's something that the news media like to talk about, no matter who's in the White House. But how the media reports the stories about unemployment will usually depend upon who or whom is in the White House, right? Let me give you a few examples. But first, let me show you a media bias chart. Now, the news agencies in blue, like MSNBC and CBS, ABC, NBC, CNN, all tend to lean left. Now, when people say you lean left, that means you have what's called a liberal bias. These are people that tend to support big government, tend to vote Democrat. Okay, that's what is meant by that. Now, the news agency, singular, on the right tends to lean right, or in the red, I should say, tends to lean right, which means they support or tend to support smaller government and would tend to support Republican or libertarian policies. Now, notice that I emphasize that word tends, because these are generalizations. I mean, it doesn't mean that every individual reporter follows the overall views of the news agency they work for. I mean, there's always exceptions. But to a large degree, ask anybody on the street who's familiar with politics, this chart is very accurate. So, how would news agencies on the left, which tend to support Democrats, tend to support bigger government, how would those news agencies on the left report on unemployment, say, administration versus a Democrat administration? Well, let's take a look. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of snippets from a great video, which actually you're going to view for your homework, or if we have time, we'll actually view it at the end of class, but I don't know that we'll have time at the end of class. But this snippet, and it's real brief, it's like a minute and a half, shows how one newscaster, the same guy, how he reported on unemployment during the Reagan years, and Reagan was a Republican, versus how he reported on the subject during the Obama years. Okay? So here we go. Charles Gibson in 1982 during the Reagan presidency. There really isn't any good news in the statistics. All the numbers are bad, and unemployment among adult men is 8.2%, the highest since World War II. All right, so you see how awful unemployment is? There's nothing good to talk about, Gibson says. Everything was doom and gloom. Okay, highest since World War II. Now, notice how this very same journalist reported on unemployment during the Obama years. Okay, Obama's a Democrat, obviously, when the unemployment rate was actually higher. So here we go. In the current economic environment, this is now Charles Gibson reporting on, yeah, I know, shock, right, Harrison? Here's Gibson reporting during the Obama presidency. In the current economic environment, sometimes a bad jobs report can look good. 345,000 American workers lost their jobs in May. A big number to be sure. Traumatic if you're one of those 345,000. But the number was smaller than economists had predicted. And that's good news. Isn't that interesting? I mean, do you see the difference there? In fact, at this time, there were a rash of articles about how, and I kid you not, how great unemployment was because dads were getting to spend extra time with their kids and with their families. But see, notice the bottom there. There at the bottom, the unemployment rate under Obama when they were reporting this was higher than it was under Reagan. Yet during the Reagan years, it was all bad news, right? Well, why wasn't it worse news under Obama when the unemployment rate was higher? Well, because of media bias. You see, they try to spin the news. I mean, you're going to love watching this example of media bias in your homework, or if we get to it at the end of class. So here's the thing. What determines how the media reports a story, or who the media will attack or give a pass to? What determines that? Well, it is exactly, it's their worldview. It's their ideology. Because even though it's true, facts are facts, and whatever the unemployment rate is the unemployment rate, although even that can be, even there they can put their thumb on the scale, and I'm not going to get into all that now. But you know, given that the facts are what they are, how we interpret those facts, or how we determine which facts are important, or which facts we report on, or which facts we choose to leave out, all depends on our story, on our worldview. In fact, that's the biggest bias. That is the biggest bias right there, is typically when the media choose not to report on something. Because they just don't think it's important, because to their liberal big government views, there may be something that just doesn't seem important to them. And I could give you so many examples of that, but we don't have time for that. But let me pause there. Any questions on that? Yes, silence. Silence is the greatest protest, yeah, and the greatest demonstration of bias. By the way, speaking of media bias, you will see this in your study place. This is part of your homework this week. It gets you to look at different examples of bias in the media. And as you can see on your screen, you've got 4 examples of media bias. 3 are articles. 1 is this video that we may or may not get to at the end of class, and if not, you just watch it for your homework. It's short. But each of these examples of media bias comes from a different perspective, just so you get an example of bias from the political right, the political left, a biblical Christian examining bias, and then the one Charlie Gibson example that we just looked at. And the one that's underlined there, number 5, you may want to actually read that one first, because before you view the above 4 stories, because that article gives you some specifics on how to identify. And so that'll help you understand what you're viewing in the other four examples. And so even though it's listed fifth, go ahead and read it first. Then when you're finished, discuss your findings with your parents. See the underlined bolded text there? Discuss the three most common forms of bias that you see displayed in the four stories. There's probably more, but hunt for at least three. Okay, any questions on that? By the way, that there's nothing there to necessarily submit to me. This is just something fun for you to do with your parents, which will be extremely useful for you. You do this in your house always anyway. No wonder, Julia, you like politics if you've been doing this already. That's kind of the sad situation my kids are in. They can't get away from it. And so even my kids who are, out of the house and married, they'll be texting me stuff. Like, Dad, did you see blah, blah, blah? We'll still be talking about stuff. Or they'll send me, videos that they think I'd like seeing, stuff like that. Okay. So anyway, any questions on that? 8 p.m. Eastern every night right after dinner. That's awesome. Well, speaking of bias, let's talk about our founding fathers. What were the founders? What was their worldview? Were they creationists or evolutionists? What do you think? What do you think? Creationists or evolutionists? I see a few of you saying creationists. Why do you think that? Yeah, Daniel says they didn't have evolution. Um, you're both right and wrong about that, Daniel. Evolution is actually an old theory. And did you know that Charles Darwin's grandfather was actually an evolutionist? That is true. Now, so that's where you're wrong. Where you're right, Daniel, and this is what I think you meant in actuality, is that evolution had not been popularized because obviously Darwin, he wasn't around yet. And so it wasn't a popular theory yet. Now that is true. So yeah, that's one very good answer that, hey, it just, wasn't around yet. The other answer is, how do we know if they were creationists or evolutionists? Well, they actually told us. They gave us an answer. And they were creationists, and they made that very clear. Let's go to the videotape, as they say. Now, if you saw the video, you already saw this on the DVD, and a lot of you said you watched the first session. Hopefully, you stopped there. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of overlap if you're going on into the next sessions. There will be some more to read, but some of it is overlap, so I will direct you away from those. But anyway, where you were given a skeleton, so to speak, in the DVD, I want to put some more meat on the bones and explain this a little bit better. All right, so here is what we read, or what you heard read in the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, there's a lot packed in there. We're not going to get to talk about it all right now. But first, it's important to see they were creationists. They believed in God, right? I mean, they didn't say, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men evolved and that they are endowed by natural selection, right? And survival of the fittest. No, they didn't say that. They believed in God. And in fact, they said they believed in the Creator. And by the way, they said they have rights. And where did they think these rights came from? From God. We'll see this more in chapter 10. This is a really hugely important concept. So we're gonna spend some time on this. But we'll come back to this later. But the founding fathers were not only creationists, their worldview was biblical too. And so the DVD explained where they appealed for the creation of their new government. In fact, let me ask you this. What was it that they were ultimately appealing to justify their break with England and the creation of a new government? What did they appeal to? Julia says their God. Be more specific, Bob. Little line from the Untouchables there. Tyranny of the king. They did talk about the tyranny of the king, but what was it that they were specifically appealing to? And God is a good answer, and it's a big part of the answer, but I'm actually looking for something more specific. God's rights given to us. Okay, we're a little bit foggy on this one, so this is good. This is why we are reviewing this, even though this was in the it was in the DVD. So here I'm going to bring on our first reader, and that's going to be Julia. So Julia, why don't you grab your mic and let's do a quick sound check.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. How about everybody else?
Okay.
And we have no echo.
Right.
Awesome. So that sounds really good. All right, Julia, why don't you read this paragraph for us? This is the first part of the declaration, and then I'll just ask you a couple quick questions about what you read. So go ahead and read for us.
Okay. All right. Do I have to be dramatic?
You don't have to be dramatic, no. Although if you want to, I mean, you could read it with the voice of authority as, a founding father reading this, or as the town crier, hear ye, hear ye.
Okay.
So go ahead.
All right. I'll do a John Adams impression. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands with which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
Okay, great. Now stick with me. Now, it's not specifically stated there, but just so we have the context, who or what were they breaking from, Julia?
They were breaking from Great Britain.
From Great Britain, right. And more, actually, that's maybe not as specific as we should be. Who do they direct this to and show who's committed all the abuses? Yeah, the king. So we were breaking from, Great Britain, that's not a bad answer, but specifically the king, because that's who they were specifically in covenant with via the charters. By the way, 14% of American teenagers, when surveyed on that question, who were we breaking from? They said France. I don't know what it was with the fascination with France that students just, thought our Constitution was written there, think that we were breaking from them. No, we were breaking from England or, from the king specifically. Now, look at that paragraph, Julia, and by the way, you did a great job reading that. To what did they appeal to justify their break with England? It's kind of a wordy phrase that they use.
They appealed to the laws of nature and of nature's God?
Yes. Okay, without the if. So just laws of nature and of nature's God. Right. They said that the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them to do this, to the separate and equal station. In other words, the laws of nature and nature's God entitles us to be a separate and equal country amongst all the other countries of the world. Now, when they spoke of the laws of nature and nature's God, what were they referring to?
The laws of nature, obviously, when you look at nature and things like that, and you look at scripture and talking about nature and the source of everything, and of nature's God is, of course, the creator of all things and the creator of nature.
Okay. Good. All right. Thank you, Julie. Talk about this. Let's break this under understand that when they spoke of the laws of nature and nature's God, and you're going to hear me say this over and over again ad nauseum, that they were referring to the laws of the Bible. Laws of nature and nature's God equals the laws of the Bible. Now, here's the thing. They believed that God had written his laws, or I should say has written his laws in two places. He's written his laws in creation. That's what they call the laws of nature. And he's written his laws in the Bible. Okay, that's the laws of God or the laws of nature's God. Either way you could say it. But even though they're seen in different places, they believed the laws were one and the same. Now, let's step this back a little bit. Okay, we're talking about laws that were written in creation. What are God's laws written in creation? I mean, do you dig them up? Do you find them engraved on a tree? I mean, when you talk about laws of nature, where do you find them? Now, Mark, that's part of it. Yes, there are physical laws, and Sir Newton, of course, discovered a lot of the physical laws, et cetera, et cetera. But physical laws like gravity and things like that aren't so much applying to, things about like where do our rights come from or what should government do or not do. That gets to more the laws, as Brooks said, of conscience. The laws that are written on our conscience. And of course, we know that the Apostle Paul makes that case, and it's probably not the only place in Scripture, but in Romans 2, man, he hammers this point home. Even Gentiles, in other words, non-Christians, who do not have God's written law, show, or I should say non-Jews. Gentiles were non-Jews, although at this period in history, most Gentiles were not Christians, so it's almost like one and the same. But to be more technical, Gentiles were non-Jews. Even Gentiles who do not have God's written law show that they know his law when they instinctively obey it, even without having read it. They demonstrate that, here it is, God's law is written in their hearts for their own, and there's the word that who mentioned it, Brooks, that Brooks mentioned, for their own conscience and thoughts either accuse them or tell them that they're doing right. So, a person who's never heard of Jesus or the Ten Commandments can never claim he's innocent, because we all disobey, and we all know we disobey because God has written his laws on the human heart. Those are the laws of nature. And that's what the founding fathers meant when they spoke of the laws of nature. They were the laws that God has written on our hearts. But this is really important. They're also the same laws that are in the Bible. So the founders were really appealing to the laws of the Bible to break with England. By the way, not France. They weren't breaking with France. But they were appealing to the laws of the Bible to set up a new government. Now, I'm still connecting the dots here, because if I were in your shoes, I would probably be saying at this point, I still don't see it, Mr. Pratt. All right, I get that. I'm still building the case here. Let me show you what they themselves said about this back in the founding era, okay? Now, you already saw this quote in the DVD, but boy, this is an important enough quote to read again. Now, John Quincy Adams, I should say, great man, our sixth president, was a bona fide Christian. I don't know that his father was, John Adams. I don't think his father was. He was a Unitarian. But John Quincy Adams did not hold to those views, and as far as I can tell from my reading of history and reading his own writings, he is a bona fide Christian. Look at what he said. Okay, this was taken from a July 4th celebration speech that he gave in 1821. I've actually got an actual copy of this from the library. This was awesome. Copied it off of a microfiche. But he said that by appealing to the laws of nature and nature's God, the founders were affirming their submission to the laws of the Bible. Here's what he said. From the day of the Declaration, the American people were bound by the laws of God, which they all, and by the laws of the gospel, which they nearly all acknowledged as the rules of their conduct. Now, you see what he's saying? He's saying that at the time of the Declaration of Independence, they were all binding themselves to God's law. And he was saying almost all of them, they nearly all, were bound by the laws of the gospel. In other words, he was saying that they were almost all Christians. I mean, he couldn't say they were all Christians because there were people like his dad who weren't. But they were almost all Christians, nearly all bound by the laws of the gospel. Well, where does he get this? Where does he get the audacity to say that everybody was binding themselves to the laws of God at the time of the Declaration of Independence? Father attended seminary and then left to pursue law, but I believe you actually... So, Julia, you're saying that you think his dad was a believer, even though the church... but actually, I think his dad, even at that time, was a Unitarian. And in fact, people accused John Quincy of being a Unitarian. And we actually get into this in the second semester. But he, through letters, very forcefully argued for the Trinitarian view. And, of course, if you're a Unitarian, by the way, for those who don't know, a Unitarian believes that when they say there's only one God, they deny the Trinity. There's only one person in God. They do not believe Jesus was divine. And, of course, that's a real problem for getting saved, because if Jesus is not divine, then you don't have a Savior. So Unitarians have a real problem when it comes to having real forgiveness for their sins. I don't think he was a deist, though. And that's actually in the second semester another thing we talk about, too, the whole deism thing. Actually, what you find, I know that today it's very in vogue to say the Founding Fathers were deists. There was actually very, very, very few of them that were. Deism is like the clockmaker God. God winds up the world and then is not active. Probably the most notorious of them all would have been Benjamin Franklin, who at a time in his life was a deist. But at the end of his life, when he was in the Constitutional Convention, part of the writing of the Constitution, was clearly not a deist anymore. Although, sadly, I don't think he was a believer. Now, I do think most of the Founding Fathers were believers, but I find it interesting that the ones that our secular society today chooses to highlight most prominently are Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, because they're the two most notable non-Christians in the bunch. They were very Christian in their thinking, if that makes sense, but they were clearly not Christians by the things they said. Same thing with John Adams. But all the rest of them were members of bona fide denominations, and so they'd taken like an oath or whatever to join a church. So basically taking a gospel related oath. So most of them were believers. But getting back to John Quincy Adams, he's saying that they were all bound by the laws of God. Well, where did he get that? Well, he got that from the laws of nature and nature's God. Yeah, some of them were ministers, like John Witherspoon was a minister who helped write the Declaration of Independence and signed the Declaration of Independence. But, this phrase, laws of nature and nature's God, they were all agreeing to being bound by God's laws. And this is a point that James Wilson made. Wilson was one of the few men to sign both the Declaration and the Constitution. And he became also one of the first U.S. Supreme Court justices. So you might say he was a real bigwig back in his day. But anyway, pardon the pun. In regard to the laws of nature, This is what Wilson said. God has made law for man, but it should be remembered that this law, natural or revealed in the Bible, flows from the same divine source. It is the law of God. The law of nature and the law of revelation, or as the Declaration of Independence said, the law of nature is God. Both of these laws are both divine. It is indeed preposterous to separate them from each other. So in other words, he's saying they're both the same law, just that they're written in different places. Let me demonstrate this with a chart. You've got God, the Creator, who has written his law in two different places. There's the laws of nature, what our founders called the laws of nature, which were those laws written on man's heart. That's why they're in nature, because we're in nature. So those laws are written on our heart. That's what Romans 2 says. So those are the laws of nature. But then there's the laws that are revealed in the Bible. You know, like 2 Timothy 3:16. All Scripture is inspired by God. So, you know, the laws that are in the Scripture are inspired by God. They're revealed by God. So I've shown you through their own writings why they thought laws of nature and laws of God, or laws of nature and of nature's God, were the laws of the Bible. But you may be scratching your head and say, well, why didn't they just say that? Why didn't they just say the laws of the Bible? It's a very simple answer, and it's an answer to which a lot of modern day historians overlook. And that is, we impose our own way of thinking today on people of yesteryear. Because see, the point is, this was the language of the day. This terminology had been used in the church, and in government for 500 years. This was language, and I'm talking about like phrases like laws of nature and laws of God. You see them in sermons. Okay, the sermons in the 1700s, you see that phrase. You see government leaders using that phrase. In fact, are any of you here belong to a Presbyterian church? You know, I attend a PCA church, Presbyterian church in America. Any of you PCA or otherwise have the Westminster Confession of Faith as one of your, you know, like your catechisms that you use? None of you? Okay, I'm the only Presbyterian in the class, huh? You're familiar with the catechism. Okay. Anyway, the Westminster Confession of Faith was written in the 1600s. If you read through that, it uses that phrase, laws of nature. You know, this is one reason why a lot of people look back at the founders and say, oh, they were deists, because look at these phrases they use, like laws of nature, totally neglecting the fact that that's how Christians spoke back then. See, that's the error of taking our bias from today and imposing it on the past, you know. But it's just the way they spoke. It's the terminology that Christians for hundreds of years were using in sermons. And so they were explaining to the world why they were breaking from England. Now, it's probably different from how we would say it today if we were trying to communicate the same truth. But, you know, that's today. This was back then. This was the terminology they used. But, of course, this is a much different kind of thinking from what you hear today. I mean, today you wouldn't hear people wanting to refer to laws of the Bible in a government context. In fact, you hear the opposite, don't you? You frequently hear things like separation of church and state. We'll actually deal with that later in the course, in Chapter 11. And then we'll spend a few weeks on it in the Semester 2 class, because it's such an important issue that we really need to understand as Americans understanding our society today. But, you know, it's quite common to hear people say, oh, you know, there's no absolute right or wrong. Everybody has their opinion. You can't impose your morality on anybody else. Have you ever heard that? Have you ever heard somebody say there are no absolutes? I always laugh when somebody says that, because when they say there are no absolutes, what have they just done? Yeah, that's an absolute. They've just contradicted themselves. That's exactly right. Because they've just made an absolute statement. And to be sure, it's a strange position for government. I mean, if no morality can be imposed, then what the heck is government doing? Because they impose somebody's morality, and here's the thing, it's either going to be God's morality or it will be man's morality. You know, if I'm a public school teacher, I may think it's okay to pray before class because, hey, I'm a Christian. You know, I might want to pray. You all noticed that I led off the class in prayer this afternoon. Well, for some of you, it's morning, right? Or I should say, for one of you, right? For Sarah, it's morning for you. But you know, in the United States, and I don't know how it is in Australia, but in the United States, the government has imposed a non-Christian morality in the schools and said, oh, that's true for you too, Logan, right? Because, wait a minute. Oh, yeah, 6 p.m. Yeah, 6 p.m. For Daniel, I guess it just turned noon for Daniel. But anyway, here in the U.S., the government has imposed a non-Christian morality, and they tell professors you cannot pray before class. See, that's the morality that's been imposed on them. Because let's face it, laws deal with right and wrong. It says this activity is right, and then it punishes activity that it says it's wrong. So it is really, 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 really important to have God's view on things, to have a biblical worldview. Let me give you an example that really shows why it's so important to have a biblical worldview, why it's so important to apply God's word to every area of our lives, including government. Does everybody know who Adolf Hitler was? I'm sure most of you know. Right. I'm sure there's nobody here who doesn't know, right? What is he most known for? No, it's not his mustache. What was it? Yeah, Holocaust, right? World War II. Okay, good. So, I mean, not good that he did that, good that you know that. Because if you've ever seen the video 180 by Ray Comfort, you see that a lot of people today, a lot of teenagers today, young adults, aren't even aware of what happened in the 1940s. It's really sad. Kids are not being taught history. Anyway, given the fact that Adolf Hitler was so evil, for those who know who he was and what he did, makes this next story so interesting. And this comes from the Washington Times. In 20 years of college teaching, Professor Robert Simon has never met a student who denied that the Holocaust has happened. Although notice the dateline on this article, 1997. There's a whole fresh crop of students today, like I was saying, that don't even know about the Holocaust. But anyway, at this point in time, never met one who denied the Holocaust happened. But what he sees quite often, though, is worse. Students who acknowledge the fact of the Holocaust, but can't bring themselves to say that killing of millions of people is wrong. What? Yeah. Mr. Simon says that 10% to 20% of his students feel this way. 10 to 20%? He says usually they deplore what the Nazis did, but their disapproval is expressed as a matter of taste or personal preference, not moral judgment. Of course I dislike the Nazis, one student told him, but who's to say they are morally wrong? Wow. What's the problem that these kids have? What's the problem they have? Ignorance, stupid? Yeah, it's actually closer to what Daniel and Julia are saying, because these are actually really bright kids. They're actually being logically consistent to their worldview. You see, they would be right if there is no absolute truth. One, then they are right. but there's a God. And of course, wrong if he's revealed his word and his word applies to every area of life. They're absolutely wrong. You see, and that's the problem. We live in a day when people reject moral absolutes. They reject right and wrong. They don't want to acknowledge that there's a God that they must answer to. And so they reject the notion that government officials must answer to God. People are incensed with that clerk court. Huh, I'm not saying it right. But anyway, that government employee in Kentucky who won't issue homosexual marriage licenses because she's saying there's a higher law that I have to obey. That outrages people. Well, if there is no higher law that we're to obey, then there's no way you can say Hitler was wrong. But if we do have a biblical worldview, then we must agree that God rules over everything, even kings and queens, even presidents, congressmen, mayors, the dog catcher, who knows, whatever, right? But anybody in authority. Let's take a look at what the Bible says about this. And you've got this slide. Just write real brief notes in the blanks provided. 1 Timothy 6:15. The Apostle Paul says, he refers to God as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Okay? Short and sweet. The King of Kings, Lord and Lords. Actually, same thing in Revelation 19:16. Jesus is called King of Kings and Lord and Lords. But here's what's amazing. We also see this same thing in Psalm 2, an Old Testament passage. Now, here's where I want to get Logan, my second reader, if you'd come in to read. So let me enable Logan. Let's do a quick sound check. We have a little bit of an echo. So if you're able to point your speakers away from your mic, that could help alleviate that. So Logan.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay. I can hear you great. But I can also hear me. I don't want to hear me. Is there any way you can point the speakers away?
Yeah, 1 second.
Okay, that sounds much better. Well, it sounds better. I wouldn't say much better. All right, let's go with it. Logan, if you would please read Psalm 2, and then I'll ask you a couple questions about it. So go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. I did not advance the slide. I'm asking you to make bricks without straw. There you go. Go ahead and read what I've got on the screen now.
Okay. I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you be destroyed in your way. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him.
Okay. Now, so Logan, let me ask you a couple questions. We don't know specifically who wrote this, although, we always assume that David wrote it. He may be the author. But as you look at who he's speaking to, he's addressing people in verse 10. Who is he speaking to in this psalm?
The people? Or the kings?
Yes, generally. Kings. Which kings?
The rulers.
Which rulers? Be more specific, Bob. I love that line from the Untouchables. Not Untouchables, dang, what was the movie? I said it earlier. Incredibles. Thank you. Anyway, yeah, which rulers? Of
the ones who govern over us? Of the earth?
So in other words, my point is, I know that sounds obvious, but what the reason I asked that, because I want to emphasize, he's not just speaking to future kings in Israel. Okay, do you see that? He's speaking to rulers in the earth. Okay, now, what is he telling them?
To serve the Lord with fear and rejoice and trembling.
Yeah, so he's saying, hey man, Yeah, God is your authority. Okay, you need to, you know, he's your boss. But then in verse 12, he says something very interesting. He says, "Kiss the Son, lest he be angry." Now, this is not S-U-N, son. Who is he talking about?
Um,
I know
Jesus.
I can
I
see
would
the
say Jesus
tension
the
because
Son.
you're thinking, well, this is Old Testament. I know what I want to say, but how could it possibly be? Just remember, David was a prophet. So who's he talking about? I mean, he's just told them in verse 11, serve the Lord. So who might this son be that he's saying kiss the son? You're getting some tag team help in your chat box, by the way.
Yeah, Jesus.
Jesus. Yeah, that's the answer that's right 9 out of 10 times in Sunday school anyway. That's the right answer here. Logan, thank you so much. You did a great job on this. Isn't this interesting? Man, this is Old Testament stuff, but David is prophesying, but he's doing more than he's prophesying not only in the like prophetic future sense, but he's also prophesying in the sense of like, let me lay it on the line. This is the way it is. You kings of the earth, serve the Lord, and you better kiss the Son. I'm not even sure that David at this point had a full understanding of Jesus in a manger, being born of Mary and Joseph. I wouldn't argue for that. All I'm arguing is that he's writing from a spirit-filled perspective, and he's laying it on, saying, and here's what you come away with: kings of the earth, not just in Israel, kings of the earth are under the authority of the Son. They're under the authority of Jesus. Jesus is king over all the kings or governments of the earth, which is, of course, what Paul says very clearly in the New Testament: King of kings, Lord and lords. But the important point here is it's not just in Israel, it's all over the boss over civil rulers. And he gives them authority. Now let's review the whole power versus authority. Now you saw an older picture, I think, in the DVD. So let me give you a newer, more updated picture here. I got to go back here to the slides. There we go. Oh my goodness, we're at 6:15. Boy, let me wrap. Man, how did the time go so quickly? Okay, bear with me. There's my family. Let me wrap this up real quick. In terms of power versus authority, this is a really important point. There's a difference between power and authority. Power is the ability to do something, the legitimate right to do something. I gave you the example of the wrestler next door. I might have the power to go over and spank his kids. I don't have the authority to do that. Well, that is just as an important distinction when we're discussing what government can do, because government frequently exercises just mere power just because it can, and it ignores authority, what it's legitimately able to do. And the major chapter on that is Romans 13. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. That's the Greek word exousia. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Notice Paul did not use the word power, which the word dunamis, which we get dynamite. He used the word authority. Civil government has authority. That means there's some things they should do, have to do. That means there's things that they can't do, right? And what is it that they're supposed to do? Let me just paraphrase verses 3 and 4. They are supposed to punish evildoers. Look at verse 4. If you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So real quickly, a couple of questions here for you to consider. I know I had to breeze through this. I apologize. We're having too much fun there. Question number one, should government punish all sins? Should government punish all sins? What do you think? Brooks says no. Yeah, I mean, have you ever told a lie? Have you ever been unkind? Have you ever been angry without cause? Have you ever, lusted in your heart? I mean, all these things are sins, okay? But God actually never says that these are crimes where government punishes all those things that I just listed. So, how do you decide what sins are crimes? What sins should be punished by government? Well, you're never going to know if there's no standard. This is an example of a principal who almost got punished for he was charged criminally for praying at a school event. He was facing jail time and a $5,000 fine. Now, thankfully, he beat it in court. But see, this is the battle that we're facing. When officials reject God's standard, there's still going to be a standard. It's just not going to be God's standard. It'll be man's standard. And man's standard can be very, very harsh. Now, we're going to be delving into this a little bit more deeply in the upcoming classes, okay? But real quickly, I need to go over what's homework for next week. If you didn't view the session 1 video, it looks like a lot of you did, but if you didn't, make sure you see it. It's on disc 1. It's called The Biblical Basis for Government. So go ahead and view that. Because anything from the videos that I assigned could wind up on a test. So make sure you see it. The thing that's due next week as far as like in your study place is the quiz on the Declaration. Read the Declaration, which is in Appendix C of your book, and then take the open book quiz. It's an open book quiz. That means you can have the Declaration of Independence open, and it's there in your assignments tab. Now, in your assignments tab, if you're new to Potter School, if you go in your study place, see how I've highlighted assignments? And there you see the 3 things that are due next week. And when I say next week, that's right before class. Now, you'll notice there's only one that's actually due as far as like turning something into me for me to see. That's your quiz. It's an online quiz. You'll take it there. But you'll also have 2 things that are due. There's the video that some of you already saw it. If you didn't, make sure you watch the video. And then those questions about media bias. There's those 4 or 5 things to read and then discuss it with your parents. Okay? You don't turn that into me, but it's still there in your assignments tab just to let you know it's due. Okay. Whew, I ran through everything. Boy, I speeded through that. Questions. Would you suggest that we type something up on it, just for the records? Are you talking about the questions on media bias? No. Oh, for you to keep, yes. I would say I would suggest it, yes, and keep it in your notebook. By the way, I hope everybody does keep a government notebook. I think that'd be very helpful to have, to keep all your notes in. Please do that, because otherwise what happens is all your weekly notes get spread out all over the class, and I even saw this happen with my own kids when they took the class. So keep it in a government notebook, have a homework section, a class notes section, and yeah, keep that in your class notes section. I think that will be very, very helpful for you. Although I'm not requiring you to type out the questions and keep it. There are other things that I will require you to type out, but not that. Okay? Good question. Any other questions? Are there any questions that I missed? Especially since I had to sort of speed talk through that last part of it. Hopefully all that was clear. Was all that clear in talking about power versus authority? Because that's the basis of what we're going to be talking about this semester. And if you didn't see the DVD, that'll come in hopefully into sharper focus, and you'll see what the heck I was talking about with the with the wrestler next door. True story. Or based on a true story, I should say. All right. Then I think we're done. Sorry, usually I will not hold you over till 7 minutes afterwards. I don't know why that happened this time. That typically will not happen, and so in fact, sometimes we'll make it up. I'll let you out a little bit early, but that wasn't today. Hey, it's a little harder. Our first day of class, we're talking about where everybody was from. Yes, we're all enthusiastic. Okay, anything else then for the good of the order? If not, then I will see you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. You're very welcome for first class. Take care, everybody. We had a great time. Bye.